Plant taxonomy. A name is unique. It identifies a unique individual, distinguishable from another individual. Just as we have a unique name to set us apart from others, plants also have a unique name, a scientific name. Plant names help horticulturalists understand the classification of plants and recognize plants by their characteristics. This topic describes how plants are named. Also described are the plant characteristics that are used to classify and identify plants. The history of plant taxonomy. The earliest record of categorizing plants into groups belongs to Theophrastus. He was an assistant to Aristotle. So this goes back to 370 to 285 BC. So it's obviously a very, very long time ago. He just divided plants by their growth into characteristics into trees, shrubs, half-shrubs, and herbs. So he noticed a wide range of plant features, but it was Carolus Linnaeus, or Carl von Linné as he was born, who really dug in to classifying based solely on flower structures. He also even wrote a book called Species Plantarum in 1753, and he described more than 1,300 plants placed into classes. So he was born as Carl von Linné in the mid-1700s. He is a Swedish botanist, so that means he really studied plants. And he's the one that is credited to making this naming system that we still use today. So you see there in bold, it says binomial. So the binomial system gives plants two names. So obviously a plant's scientific name, and we're going to discuss this later, is very long, and we're not going to call a plant by 7 or 8 different names. We're going to go by those two names, very similar to how you go by two names. So whatever your first name and your last name is, you put it together, and that's basically a binomial, two names. So he was such a nerd about Latin, he even changed his name to represent a Latin structure. So we know him as Carolus Linnaeus. So why Latin? Scientific names were derived from the Latin language because it was used extensively by the early scholars to describe plants. Latin is an international language and the origin of many languages. So because it's the origin of many, it's going to be easier to transfer it to use worldwide. So we're going to dig into the botanical and scientific names. You're going to hear me call it botanical names or scientific name. Either way, I mean the same thing. This is going to be that Latin form where we use a level of hierarchy to classify a plant. The first name that we're going to talk about when we talk about scientific names is the generic name. A lot of times you're going to hear this called the genus. Plants in the same genus have similar characteristics and are more closely related to each other than they are to plants in any other genus. The generic name is usually a noun, so that means it's like a place, person, or thing. Some examples of genus, ones that you will learn will be Acer, and that's going to include all the maples. So there's many different types of maples, but if it is a maple, it is in the genus Acer. Same thing with Ilex, including all hollies. There are many types of hollies, but they are all in the genus Ilex. So I like to tell people the genus is very similar to your last name. Usually people with the same last name as you, the people that are in your little immediate family, you're very similar to them. The next part of a scientific or botanical name is the plant's scientific or specific name. We're going to call this the species, and this is just going to break it down even further. So plants in the same species have similar characteristics and consistently produce plants of the same type. So the genus is similar, but the species gets even more detailed with the similarities. The specific name is usually an adjective and is more descriptive. So if you learn more about the Latin language and you see those specific names, a lot of times you'll be able to see like, oh, cordata, that is a Latin word. It's used a lot in describing heart-shaped leaves. It may describe a distinguishing feature of a plant, or it may give geographical information about where a plant originated or where it occurs naturally. We're going to see that more. All right, so as we get into more plant ID, you're going to see more of a third name, and that can either be a variety or a cultivar. And that's just going to break down even more of the difference within a species. So the more words we add, the more and more descriptive we get. So there is a difference in that third word because, like I said, it is a variety or a cultivar. A variety is a difference in species that occurs naturally. So I mentioned in the last unit mutations within DNA of a plant and how that can be used as a good thing, especially for plant breeders. So if you're going out on a nature walk and there's a plant that typically has thorns and you come across a plant growing out in the wild that doesn't have those thorns that typically are shown, that is a variety. A cultivar, and a lot of times you'll see this represented as CV, is a difference in species that occurs as a result of man's influence after the plant has been in cultivation. A cultivar may be the result of cultural practices, propagation practices, and they result from a mutation inducing chemicals. So cultivar is like a man-made change in the plant's DNA. So plant breeders that are focusing more on trying to get a specific trait or a specific gene and trying to make it look a certain way, that's going to be the cultivar. Variety is natural. So you're probably wondering, how are scientific names helpful? Like you just told me, if I learn more about Latin, it'll help me identify the plant. These names are descriptive. Names used in the scientific names of plants may describe the form of the leaf. So acerifolious could mean the leaf looks like a maple, because there are some trees that are not maple, but their leaves look similar to it. And sometimes their species name is acerifolious. Buxifolious means it's going to have boxwood-looking leaves. Parvifolious can mean it has small leaves. So usually anytime you see folia, F-O-L-I-A or U at the end, you're going to be talking about leaves. Because you talk about fall foliage, you're talking about the leaves turning colors in the fall. So folia is leaves. Color of flowers or the color of the foliage. Alba is going to mean white, Acanus is gray, Purpureus is purple, and Rubens is red. Sometimes you'll also see rubrum, but it's very similar in that format. So rubra, Rubens, red. It could also be describing the form or habit of growth. If you see the word altus, that can mean it's a tall plant or a tall shrub. Compactus is usually going to mean it is condensed and it is compact, so smaller and bushier typically. Nanus is going to mean dwarf. Reptans is going to mean creeping. It could also describe the native habitat. So if you see the species Americana or Americana, however you want to say it, that's going to mean it's of America. Chinensis can mean it's of China. Japonicum, and we do have a lot of Japanese plants, especially in North Carolina because we have similar climates. So you'll see Japonicum or Japonicus a lot. That's going to be representative that it originated in Japan. What advantages to using and learning scientific names? Scientific names avoid confusion. One plant may have many common names. So, for example, a border forsythia. I like to call it forsythia just because that is its genus name, and anywhere you go, it's going to be a forsythia. That's going to be the genus name, regardless of where I go in the world. In Columbus County alone, I've heard people call it yellow bells. I've heard them call it forsythia, and there's probably 5 other names that people can call it. So using the scientific name is going to avoid that confusion. Scientific names are used worldwide. Again, let's say I go to Japan because I'm like really into horticulture and I'm into gardening and I get the chance to go and I want to purchase a specific plant. I don't speak Japanese, but if I go to a nursery that is knowledgeable about plants, they are going to use the same scientific name for a specific plant that I would use. So if I go to Japan and I ask for an Acer palmatum, even though that is not asking them in Japanese, they are going to give me a Japanese maple, an Acer palmatum. So scientific name used worldwide. Number 3, by using their scientific names, plants can be purchased with accuracy. So that just goes back to what I said. Most of your nursery and landscape people that are knowledgeable and skilled are going to be able to know what you're talking about when you use a scientific name. There is a chance you would go and you would ask for a common name of a plant and they wouldn't know what you're talking about exactly because it is a regional thing and they don't know. But if you use that scientific name, they will know. Number 4, scientific names also help in the identification and classification of plants. So being able to know more about those words can help you identify different plants. Now, there are a lot of rules about writing scientific names, and we're going to do some practice on this. So I can say there's only 5 rules. The more you practice it, the easier it gets. So spelling of a scientific or botanical name is super important because a misspelling could be a different plant. So always make sure you're spelling it the correct way. So the 5 rules, number 1, always capitalize the first letter of the generic name. So you'll see in this example, Nandina, that is my genus. The N is capitalized. Number 2, never capitalize the first letter of the specific name. Domestica is my species or my specific name. I do not capitalize the D. Number 3, always underline the generic and the specific name. So Nandina domestica, especially if I'm handwriting it, it needs to be underlined. That tells the person seeing it that it is a scientific name. Otherwise, they may not know what you're talking about. Now, if it is being typed and in a printed text, you may see it in italics. But if you are handwriting it, it needs to be underlined. Number 4 gets more into the variety name, and the variety and the cultivar are going to be written differently. So make sure you pay attention to this part. Number 4 is the variety. You can follow up the species name with the prefix VAR. So you see an example there. Here's my genus, my specific name, VAR, and that tells the reader that maculatum is my variety. Always capitalize the first letter of the variety name. Now, of course, like I said, it's going to take more practice, but someday if you're writing it, you may have to Google it, and that's cool. Just make sure you write it the correct way. Number 5 is about the cultivar. Capitalize the first letter of a cultivar name. And there's 2 different ways you can write it. You can do it with that prefix CV. CV stands for cultivar. So in this one, Ilex is my genus. Vomitoria is my species. CV is going to tell me that this next word is my cultivar. I don't have to underline it, but I do need to make sure that the P is capitalized. Or I can write it Ilex vomitoria, which is the same as rules 1 through 3. And I can put it in a single quotation. This is the way I prefer to write it, but if you prefer writing it this way, that is fine. Either ways, both are right. Neither one is more right than the other, as long as it is written the exact same way it is on this screen. This should get more into things you've learned in science class, the system of botanical classification. So this is how we are going to classify all the plants. And it breaks it down from the domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Hopefully that is something you have heard before. Some of you have these cool ways to remember that. Like you could say, King Philip came over for good spaghetti. I know that's one of them. Maybe you have a different way. So the domain, you have these 3 different types that you could go into, the eubacteria, archaea, and eukaryotes. The kingdom, there's 6 different kingdoms, but we're only focusing on the Plantae kingdom. So that's going to be all of our plants. So we are in the Plantae kingdom. Phylum, it's just going to keep dividing it up. So within that Plantae kingdom, I can also group it out into 4 major groups. Angiosperms and gymnosperms we talked a little bit about in the last unit. Angiosperms are our flowering plants. Gymnosperms are our plants that usually produce those seeds through cones. And then it can get into non-vascular plants and seedless vascular plants. From there, we can break it down even more into different classes, break it down even more into the order, and then we can break it down even more into the family. Family is one of our most useful rankings for plant growth. They usually represent similar floral structures. Floral is going to be flowers. And then from there, we get to our genus and species, which we already talked about. So I mentioned earlier common names, and I didn't really describe the common name. So Latin names can be hard to pronounce. There's probably been Latin names on this slide and on this presentation that I have pronounced the wrong way, because I'm not going to lie to you, I'm not good with other languages, and I try, but sometimes I still have to Google how to pronounce a Latin name. So to take some of that frustration out of pronunciation, we can use common names. These are going to be words that we would more likely use in everyday life. We usually refer to them this way as gardeners and just as average people. So the thing, though, is that one plant can have the many common names. I mentioned that earlier with the forsythia. Some people can call it yellow bell, some people call it something else, and it can get confusing. Sometimes 2 different plants have the same common name. So in this example down here, what we call in the U.S. a linden tree is called something different in the United Kingdom. It's called a lime tree there. So if you go over to Great Britain and you tell them you need a linden tree, they're going to be like, I have no idea what you're talking about, or they're going to give you something different than what you asked for, because it is a regional description. Now, if you were to go over to Great Britain and you know that they call it a lime tree commonly, then you might can ask for that. But that gets back into why it's important to know the scientific name. At least the genus will put you in the right category. So here is some practice for you. This gives you a botanical name or a scientific name with a cultivar. So Acer palmatum atropurpureum.